For centuries, rulers worldwide have forked out fortunes to promote the arts. Rarely have they done so in secret. This program tells a bizarre story. How, during the Cold War, an arm of the US government provided covert funding for a huge variety of cultural activity. Intriguingly, this included work by some of the most resonant names in modernist art. Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko. Even today, much of the arts establishment refuses to address the issue of this covert patronage, or even acknowledge the existence of these hidden hands. For the patron was the Central Intelligence Agency.
It's my contention that the CIA not only engaged in a cultural Cold War in the abstract and purely pragmatic way, but that they had very definite aims in view, and they had a very definite aesthetic.
The idea that the world would succumb to a kind of fascist or Stalinist concept of art and literature and music, that this was to be the wave of the future. As you look back on it even now, it's a horrifying prospect.
During the Cold War, part of the U.S. government's cultural program was to put forward the claim that there was no such program, and that the creative works of composers and movie makers and artists and so forth were done entirely independently, when in fact that was not necessarily true.
Well, as far as the attitudes that the agency wanted to inspire through these activities, clearly what they would like to have been able to produce were people who, of their own reasoning and conviction, were persuaded that everything the United States government did was right.
Autumn, Paris, 1955. At the National Museum of Modern Art, an exhibition is about to open its doors. The exhibition, which has been seen in nearly every European capital, is called Modern Art in the United States and is partly dedicated to abstract art. A new art movement known as abstract expressionism dominates. There are major paintings by artists who are to change the course of post-war art history. There's work by Willem de Kooning, by Arshil Gorky, by William Baziotes. Most of all, there's a group of paintings by Jackson Pollock. This sole surviving film reveals Pollock's splurgy, random technique as a shocking departure from recognized forms of painting. Nicknamed Jack the Dripper, he and the other abstract expressionists are unconventional, even oddballs. Several have been communists or communist sympathizers. Pollock had been actively involved in communist artists' workshops, both in the States and in Mexico. In this rare photograph, he's helping to assemble a float for a May Day celebration, portraying the destruction of Wall Street by an angry working class. Willem de Kooning and Arshil Gorky also collaborated, and along with Pollock, they were prominent in the 1955 Paris exhibition. The show got a mixed reception. One critic said, "There is nothing complicated about these works, though volumes have been written on them, and they fetch very high prices. They are complete nonsense." Now and later, many prominent art critics derided abstract expressionism.
I'll tell you this, that in the Sunday Times, John Russell wrote about Pollock, "We have it on the authority of the catalogue that this artist actually slapped the canvas with paint-covered hands. I do not think in this case it was the canvas that deserved the slap." But
the show, with its so-called commie sympathizer artists, has a secret patron, working covertly at several removes from the show's organizers and frontmen. It's the CIA.
There is a perverse way of looking at this question, which is to say the CIA took art very seriously. The great things about politicians when they get involved in art is it means something to them, whether it's the fascists or it's the Soviets or the American CIA. So there may be a really perverse argument that says the CIA were the best art critics in America in the 50s because they saw work that actually should have been antipathetic to them, made by old lefties, coming out of European surrealism, and they saw the potential power in that kind of art and ran with it. You couldn't say that of many of the art critics of the time.
The CIA's involvement with America's avant-garde raises difficult and unavoidable questions. Were the artists themselves compromised by this liaison, even if most of them knew nothing about it? Would abstract expressionism, and indeed the whole shift of cultural supremacy from Paris to New York, have taken place post-war in quite such a dramatic manner without this sponsorship? And what in God's name was the CIA doing in the business of art sponsorship anyway? Weren't they meant to be collecting intelligence and toppling foreign political opponents? There was one overpowering reason for the CIA's involvement: the Cold War. The inclusion of culture and art as weapons in the fight against communism became active policy within months of the end of the military war in Europe and the opening of the Cold War. Historians today argue over the causes of the Cold War and the extent to which Russia or America was to blame. But there's no doubting the widespread fear in the West of the Soviet Union.
Well, remember, at the end of World War II, the United States had 12 million in our armed forces. About a year later, we had about 1.5 million. We just sent them all home, sent them back to college, came home, got jobs, started making televisions and all that. The Red Army stayed almost intact. It stayed at the 5 million level. And obviously they did not demobilize the way we did. So there was a clear sense of danger that they were powerful and they could be powerful.
But the perceived threat was not just a military one. There was a growing preoccupation that the Soviets had got the upper hand on the propaganda front.
Long live peace. Long live the friendship of the peoples. These slogans inspire the working people of all lands.
Particularly worrying for successive American administrations were Soviet attempts to rally world opinion to their many peace initiatives. In 1949, the Soviets delivered a humiliating blow. They held a peace conference in America's own backyard, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Pride of the Russian delegation was composer Dmitri Shostakovich. Among the many celebrity American guests was writer Lillian Hellman. Intellectuals in America, as in Europe, were often prepared to give the Soviets the benefit of the doubt.
What was persuasive was the communist dream, or the communist delusion, and the extent to which intellectuals in France, for example, some people like Merleau-Ponty, Jean-Paul Sartre, and others, felt that communism, with all its failings, was infinitely more promising in the long run than capitalism with all its plausibilities. And this was a rather widespread feeling through much of the continent among intellectuals. Certainly was widespread in the United States. There had been a long recognition of the sacrifices the Soviet Union had made in the war, and a feeling that Marx was basically right, capitalism was rotten, communism would solve everything, and so on. And this permeated the intellectual life of most of the West.
But why were the cold warriors of the CIA attracted to the avant-garde? Combating communism on all fronts was a high American priority. The image presented in Namuth's film of Jackson Pollock, with his outre nonconformist technique, seems at odds with the government program. In fact, using abstract expressionism was a clever maneuver, and CIA staffers were perfectly suited to the task.
Most people don't understand or will be surprised by this statement, but most of the, quote, Cold Warriors were liberals, and this is particularly true about the personalities that we know that dominated the Central Intelligence Agency. They were men who came out of OSS, And before that, they were often graduates of Groton School or some of the old line prep schools on the eastern seaboard of this country. Then they went on to Harvard and particularly Yale. And they were, as such, culturally liberals in this society.
The American government under President Harry S. Truman formally established the CIA in 1947. It replaced its wartime predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, which was also known as the Oh-So-Social, on account of its smart Ivy League character. Initially, the CIA worked out of a scatter of anonymous buildings around Washington. In 1950, the CIA established a special department called the International Organizations Division, or IOD for short. The IOD was the hothouse where the CIA's cultural policy and art campaigns were conceived and nurtured. The first boss of the IOD, and indeed the brains behind the CIA's cultural Cold War campaign, was case officer Tom Braden.
We wanted to unite all the people who were writers, who were musicians, who were artists, and all the people who follow those people. You know, the people like you and me who go to concerts or visit art galleries, to demonstrate that the West and the United States was devoted to freedom of expression and to intellectual achievement without any rigid barriers as to what you must write and what you must say and what you must do and what you must paint, which was what was going on in the Soviet Union. I think we did it damn well.
Men like Tom Braden and William Colby, and many of their colleagues in the CIA, had impeccable credentials. Debonair Ivy Leaguers, they collected art and wrote books. They were comfortable talking about intellectual issues, and they enjoyed high-level contacts in the world of politics, culture, and finance.
In those days, it's hard, I think, for people, particularly of a younger generation, to understand the degree to which the government and its activities had the confidence of the people. There was almost nobody in this country that I couldn't go to in those days and say, I'm from the CIA and I'd like to ask you about so-and-so, and at the very least get a respectful reception and a discussion.
The CIA staffers were drawn to abstract expressionism for clear reasons. It was new, fresh, and creative. It was the perfect contrast to the regimented, narrow social realism favored by the communists. It was the kind of art totalitarian dictators loved to hate.
But regarding various forms of art, including such things as the abstract expressionism, other avant-garde art, I'd love to be able to say that the CIA invented it all and just to see what happened in New York and down in Soho tomorrow. But I think that what they did really was to recognize the difference, and in a way their understanding was helped because Moscow in those days was very vicious in its denunciation of any kind of non-conformity to its own very rigid patterns, and so one could quite adequately and accurately reason that anything they criticized that much and that heavy-handedly was worth support one way or another.
Perhaps one message that it does exude is that this is the creation of an individual, the individual statement. Of course, this is a very basic American idea that, you know, one man can make a difference and that the one voice has the right to speak in its own interest as opposed to the collective voice. So in that sense, you could argue, I think, that abstract expressionism is a celebration of the individual, the lone voice. And that was very much an American idea.
It was interesting to build up an image of an American artist as a superhero and a super male hero. And now we started to analyze those constructions and to say and to see on which kind of ideas those values were based, and pretty much on paternalism, on machismo and things like this. Those values were ingrained into the way those pictures were painted, right, with violence, strength, and so forth. We're also connecting with some image of what the new world order after 1945 needed in front of the threat of Stalinism. And so in movies, in culture in general in America, you have this desire to produce a very strong culture, a very strong visual culture, in order to show that the American is there to protect the free world.
So abstract expressionism became part of the arsenal of freedom. In the struggle with communism, the CIA's cultural commissars planned to mobilize abstract expressionism, the art's equivalent of long-range missiles. They had, however, a major problem. At home, abstract art was seen as subversive of true American values. Among the people who were shocked by it were Philistine but very powerful ranking congressmen, the kind of people who were to make policy in the McCarthy era. The domestic hostility to modern art had peaked in 1947, when an exhibition sponsored by the US State Department became a major political controversy. It was called Advancing American Art, and it was scheduled to travel abroad, first to Latin America, then to Europe. The array of contemporary American talent was impressive. Ben Shahn, Stuart Davis, Georgia O'Keeffe, Adolf Gottlieb. With Motherwell and Baziotes included, this was also one of the first exhibitions to feature the movement which would later be known as abstract expressionism.
And the show was organized by the State Department in order to send it to Europe, and that was quite an interesting idea, that the first time where the American government actually understood that at that time it was important to present the country to the rest of the world, in particular to Europe, to show to Europe that we are not the dollar-crazy people that we are portrayed by the Russian propaganda, that we also are creative people. And that was something very important.
But at home, the exhibition met a different response.
Your money bought these paintings.
The leader of the attack on the exhibition was another congressman, George Donderow, a Michigan Republican who believed that modernist art was part of some worldwide conspiracy. In a speech, he said,
Cubism aims to destroy by design disorder. Futurism aims to destroy by the machine myth. Dadaism aims to destroy by ridicule. Expressionism aims to destroy by aping the primitive and insane. Abstractionism aims to destroy by the creation of brainstorms. Surrealism aims to destroy by the denial of reason.
Congressman Donderow belonged to a small but vocal minority of cultural fundamentalists. No less than President Truman lent his voice to the outrage at the Advancing American Art Show, claiming, "If that's art, then I'm a Hottentot." He said that modern art was merely the vaporings of half-baked lazy people, frustrated ham and egg men. And by comparing the old masters to Jesus Christ and modern art to Lenin, he gave voice to the suspicion that modern art was communist-inspired. The notorious Un-American Activities Committee gave these suspicions further airtime by publicly grilling artists about the meaning of their work. One artist struggled in vain to show the committee that what had been described as a hammer and sickle in one of his paintings was actually the anchor of a boat. In another hearing, one congressman went so far as to claim that ultra-modern artists are unconsciously used as tools of the Kremlin, and that some abstract paintings were actually secret maps of strategic United States fortifications.
So it was a lot of silliness went on into this, but I think those cases are interesting because they show the hysteria that went on and the fear of the communists, the fear of the other, the fear of the person that we don't understand.
The State Department, reeling with shock, capitulated to the right wing. It cancelled the advancing American art show in mid-tour and announced the public sale of its contents. For those who bid, it was the bargain of the century.
Georgia O'Keeffe, Small Hill near Alcade, sold for $30. Adolf Gottlieb, The Couple, sold for $40. Ben Shahn, Hunger, sold for $60.
This rampant Philistinism signalled a crushing public defeat for the American avant-garde and its supporters. Coupled with the humiliating spectacle of McCarthy's show trials, it offered the world an image of America as a place where freedom itself was being threatened.
Just answer the question, do you know of any subversive? The best answer that I can get. Do you know of any?
The CIA, insofar as I can understand their protestations, have always maintained they were an elite organization and with elitist views and with representing an elitist culture. And they believe in elites. They believe in the conspiracy of elites, for that matter. So modern art became a part, and modern culture became a part of the elitist conspiracy. It was not the jackasses in Congress that they were representing. They were representing an avant-garde.
You have always to battle your own ignoramuses, or, to put it more politely, people who just don't understand. Take Braque, for example. People looked at some of Braque's paintings and said, well, what is it? It was non-representational, and therefore it shocked some Americans. People have to learn about art, and they have to look at it a long time. And that hadn't been done in America, except, we had paintings of waterfalls, the Hudson River School. So some people, education stopped there, and they were shocked by modern art.
The CIA, far from being shocked, saw that modern art was a crucial weapon in the Cold War. But their campaign to support the avant-garde was repeatedly complicated by the atmosphere of commie witch hunting which characterized the period. In a two-page spread in April 1949, Life magazine personalized the communist menace, attacking some of America's leading writers, authors, actors, and intellectuals. Albert Einstein, Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, Clifford Odets, Dorothy Parker, Langston Hughes, Arthur Miller, Norman Mailer, Charlie Chaplin. Hollywood made the point with more than 40 anti-communist films, their plots for the most part as unconvincing as their publicity posters. Walk East on Beacon was the inspiration of FBI boss Edgar Hoover, whose hostility to the left bordered on paranoia.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
Don't waste your bullets. Before I'm through, you might want to use them on yourselves.
When I turn this handle, the force of the explosion will scatter germs for hundreds of miles. Diseases will spread like wildfire from one end of the country to the other, infecting, crippling, paralyzing. Communism will rule the world.
The whip hand is typical of many anti-communist B-movies of the period. However unpersuasive they now seem, they reveal the depth of popular as well as official opposition to communism. The cultural flat feet of the FBI were on the warpath. It was becoming difficult for the American government openly to support abstract expressionist painters with a left-wing past. The FBI and the political right wing saw these painters and their work as subversive, even treasonous. The solution was to go covert, not a difficult reflex for the CIA.
Well, of course, one feature of doing it covertly is that the administration, the executive branch, could make the decision and do it. I mean, and it makes it a lot easier than the kind of debate that would occur with the Congress and every opinion element in the country on everything, including some of the very retrograde people who say, no, you can't support those kinds of people. They're terrible. They're softies. They're soft on communism and all the rest of it.
So what America got was the formation of an unofficial hidden arts council, a consortium which consisted of the cultural elite, the museum directors, the philanthropists, the urbane millionaires, the entrepreneurs, the critics, magazine editors, and CIA personnel. Exclusive clubs and bars were where members of the consortium did business. One of the network's leading lights was John McCloy, a former OSS agent and one of the architects of the CIA. He later had a key position on the Ford Foundation, a hugely rich charitable trust.
At the same time, McCloy is chairman of the Ford Foundation, and according to records found in the Ford Foundation's own archives, you can see that early in the 50s, the foundation was approached repeatedly by the CIA to help them provide cover for operations that they wanted to fund overseas.
But existing foundations like Ford had their limitations. They were bureaucratic, and officially at least entirely independent of the CIA. Over large dinners and ice-cold martinis, the agency's old-school ties met to discuss more flexible ways of funding. Why not create new foundations if the existing ones were a pain?
We would go to somebody in New York who was a well-known rich person, and we would say, we want to set up a foundation, and we would tell him what we were trying to do and pledge him to secrecy, and he would say, of course, I'll do it, and then you would publish a letterhead, and his name would be on it, and it would be the foundation. It was really a pretty simple device.
In this way, the CIA set up a huge network of phony foundations. One, for instance, was the Farfield.
The Farfield Foundation was a CIA foundation, and there were many such. And we used we used the names of foundations for many purposes, but the foundation didn't exist except on paper.
But foundations were only part of the picture. Millionaires and museums, or rather millionaires in museums, were also called into action. The mighty Museum of Modern Art in New York was a key player. It took up where the State Department left off after the collapsed exhibition of 1947. It stepped into the breach and vigorously set about exporting American avant-garde art to Europe.
Well, the reason the United States couldn't have a Ministry of Culture or something comparable was that traditionally art in this country always became a political football. And there were crises after crises. It was that basic situation of exhibition after exhibition being censored, senators creating great problems about contemporary American artists that made the museum realize that government was not the way for arts programs to be administered.
The Museum of Modern Art was connected to the CIA and the government by several bridges. One was Nelson Rockefeller, whose mother had co-founded the museum. After becoming president of what he called Mummy's Museum in 1939, Rockefeller continued to dominate through the 40s and 50s. In 1940, he also directed the Office of Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, a government agency that sponsored overseas art shows for propaganda purposes. The Museum of Modern Art became a contractor for these shows. There was also William Paley, president of CBS and a founding father of the CIA. Paley sat on the members' board of the museum's international program. So did Julius Fleischmann, who was also president of the CIA's Farfield Foundation. And then there was John Hay Whitney, a longtime trustee of the museum, who served as its president and chairman of the board. He had served in the Overseas Security Service the wartime precursor to the CIA. The Whitney Trust, which he founded, was used as a CIA conduit. Whitney also had his own museum.
One thing that is illustrative of this whole process is, say, for example, the Whitney Museum. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Whitney Museum is a CIA front. What I am suggesting is that senior trustees and boards of director members of the Whitney Museum can be shown to have wittingly served as CIA fronts during the Cold War, and that the Whitney Museum had a cultural agenda that it took on the road around the world. Now, did the CIA sit down and write a memo, say, you go take that on the road? I don't know. I haven't seen such a memo. Did the men who worked hand in glove with the agency also work hand in glove with the apparatus that produced culture during the Cold War? Yes, without a doubt. That's clear on its face.
Well, there was a series of articles relating the Museum of Modern Art's international program to cultural propaganda, and even suggestions that it was associated with the CIA. And since I worked there through those years, I can say categorically untrue. So far as I'm concerned, the main emphasis of the international program was about art. It wasn't about politics, and it wasn't about propaganda.
Yet in the late 40s, the executive secretary of the Museum of Modern Art was none other than Tom Braden, the man who launched the CIA's cultural offensive. It's now known that the CIA had a handle on several Museum of Modern Art exhibitions in Europe. The most ambitious of these took place in May 1952 and was the focal point of Nicholas Nabokov's massive festival in Paris, Masterpieces of the 20th Century. In his memoirs, Nabokov wrote,
"Not in my wildest dreams could I have expected that my dream festival would be supported by America's spying establishment. Nor did I know the fare for my delightful first-class flight to Paris was being paid by the CIA."
The festival represented all the performing arts, with the Boston Symphony Orchestra well to the fore. The art exhibit, which included all the great masters of 20th century avant-garde art, was organized by the Museum of Modern Art. The museum's curator was contracted to the festival's organizers, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. This front organization was to prove to be the cornerstone of the CIA's Secret Arts Council. Inspired and created by the CIA, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was launched with lavish fanfare in 1950. For more than a quarter of a century, the Congress was the largest, most elaborate organization of intellectuals in existence. At its height, it had offices in some 35 countries and about 280 employees. It published dozens of magazines and counted among its members a roll call of the West's most notable writers, historians, scientists, and thinkers. The CIA paid the bills and expected a return on its investment. Key personnel in the Congress were either working directly for the CIA or attending regular meetings with the agency.
I don't think I should tell you who the agents in the Congress for Cultural Freedom were, because I don't know whether, I mean, I'm sure they're very old men, as I am, but I don't know that they would like that, even now. Maybe they would. If they would, I apologize to them.
Tom Braden did agree to talk about one former colleague.
We had a brilliant man in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, one among several, the sort of executive director of the organization. His name was Michael Josselson. I speak of him with regret because he's dead, and with pride at having known him. He's one of the world's unsung heroes.
Josselson was the brains. Nicholas Nabokov, composer and cousin of the novelist Vladimir Nabokov, was the front man. And Melvin Lasky, Cold Warrior par excellence, was a key CIA contact.
And was present at various meetings, and some of the top CCF people, including Lasky and others, would be at a meeting, and then the agency people who were in charge and a couple of ringers like me were brought in on the side, and we would sit around and talk about what ought to be done or where it ought to be done, and it was very much an open exchange. Of course, there were security checks, and people who were presumed to be communist agents and that sort of thing were worked off to the side.
We did exercise a degree of control. We had agents in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, paid by us, paid agents by us on the U.S. CIA payroll, who were in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom people didn't know that.
The Congress for Cultural Freedom was an expensive operation. To pay for it, the CIA were to use their ever-growing network of foundations. If pressed, they resorted to cruder practices.
It's easy to pass money around the world, as you know, to the desired end objective, and it might not be one bulk payment, but various small payments going in the right direction. This goes all the way to the rather more naked thing that I was engaged in, putting bundles of local currency in the back of my car and driving out and transferring them to another fellow's car.
The U.S. effort to combat communism depends not only on its information services, but also on the material assistance of the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan proved an irresistible opportunity for the CIA to funnel cash to its clients.
During the first part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the Marshall Plan was in existence, and there were counterpart funds. And through the Marshall Plan and its counterpart funds, we got money to the Congress for Cultural Freedom and many other organizations in Europe.
Tom Braden's admission that the CIA used the Marshall Plan as a conduit for the secret funding of arts activities is historically of considerable importance. The Marshall Plan came into operation in 1948. It was an American-sponsored program devised to regenerate Europe's economies after the devastation of World War II. The Marshall Plan was trumpeted as a humanitarian aid package, and it did contribute significantly to post-war reconstruction. But the CIA exploited the operation of the plan to further a covert U.S. government agenda. The CIA's sophisticated rules for dispersing their secret arts budget have been revealed by Tom Braden. Limit the money to amounts private organizations can credibly spend. Disguise the extent of American interest. Protect the integrity of the organization by not requiring it to support every aspect of official American policy. Through the Congress, the CIA effectively became proprietor of several of the most prestigious and influential magazines of the day. Encounter, whose editors included Stephen Spender and Melvin Lasky, is perhaps the best remembered. Other such magazines were Ignazio Siloni's Tempo Presente in Italy, Cuadernos in Spain, Quadrant in Australia, Quest in India, and in France, Preuve magazine. These journals provided a useful base for critics sympathetic to the New York painters. The most prestigious exhibition of abstract expressionism toured Europe in 1958 to 59. It was called the New American Painting, and all the leading artists were there. The exhibition's secret patrons were determined to show the Europeans that anything they could do, the Americans could do better. The battle for supremacy between Europe, especially Paris, and America, especially New York, was on.
It's important to see the subtler ramifications of this so we don't, end up with this sort of crude conspiracy theory. And it's more interesting, too. When I talk to both of the few former spooks that I talked to, and then the intellectuals, Mary McCarthy and her circle, there was one similarity that they all talked about, the real antagonist. It wasn't nothing from the Soviet Union or Moscow. There's never any discussion of the writers' union in Moscow or what writers were saying, or except those that were being exiled or muffled, and of course that was serious. But they're really obsessed with Sartre and de Beauvoir and Le Temps Moderne, and that was the center of that was the other side.
Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir used their literary journal Les Temps Modernes to propagate an independent left-wing anti-American line. They resisted CIA-backed offers of newsprint and cash, though in the late 1940s the whole European press was in dire financial straits. But other publishers and cultural institutions did succumb to American blandishments.
We've got to remember that when we're speaking of those years, that Europe was broke. If there was a dime to be had anywhere, it was probably in some criminal organization. There wasn't any money. And they naturally looked to the United States for money.
At this time, the Rockefellers launched a huge program for the corporate buying up of avant-garde art, referred to by Nelson Rockefeller as free enterprise painting, starting with their own Chase Manhattan Bank here in New York, where John McCloy was chairman. This program had a budget of $500,000 a year, and today the bank's collection stands at over 13,000 abstract works. With this kind of money, the New York art world was able to oil the machine that would package and export abstract expressionism to the world. Dealers, museums, art publishers and journals, many of them funded by the CIA, and critics jostled for places on the avant-garde production line. And for their work ethic, they only had to look to Clement Greenberg, abstract expressionism's most zealous shop steward.
I don't think Clem was much of a writer or much of a critic for that matter. If you read his pieces, you'll find them opaque, as I've always done, and his arguments tendentious, but he did understand that America after the war had now become the center of the world, and therefore it had to be the center of the art world as well. And so it was time to promote a uniquely American art to represent our new influence and power. That is, you couldn't be a great power if you didn't have art to go with it.
Clement Greenberg, arguably the most influential post-war art critic, was a paradox. A former Trotskyist, he was part highbrow aesthete, part passionate supporter of individual artists, part cultural Cold Warrior. He sat on the American branch of the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom. Greenberg died in 1994, his reputation still controversial.
What he did was what all critics did. He committed himself to a position, he argued it, and he supported a different kind of art. What more would you want of a critic?
I mean, the world has got to come to the realization that Greenberg is not an art critic. He had no real sensibility. He is nothing but a power merchant who found a medium in which he could exercise enormous international power and money, you see.
Was Clement Greenberg responsible for inflating the reputation of abstract expressionism? Was the CIA in part responsible for its success? Were the artists themselves compromised? Is their work frail in its reputation? Although the artist and critic Patrick Heron was one of the earliest English champions of abstract expressionism, he has now become famously disillusioned.
I mean, Rothko is purely symmetrical as between left and right. Newman was symmetrical in that he put a bar down one side and a bar down the other, or did at that stage. I analysed painter after painter after painter, and even found that, with the exception of de Kooning and of Motherwell, they were really all symmetry-based. I mean, symmetry is very easy to do, and symmetry has got this kind of physical punch about it. As I said, like the Japanese flag, like the cenotaph, like the Union Jack. I mean, an imperialistic image symmetry is the essence of imperialistic images, power images, is symmetry. 30 years later, or whatever it is, my view of the whole development of American painting, the abstract expression, is fantastically unfavorable. I think it is very, very minor stuff from beginning to end. I mean, who would go halfway around the world if they say they found 3 new Rothkos or 4 new early de Koonigs? Nobody. I mean, I'd go to the other side of the world to see 1 new Matisse, 1 new Bonnard, 1 new Braque, or 1 new Picasso. You know, there's a fantastic gap.
Well, abstract expressionism was like the emperor's clothes. You parade it down the street and you say that it's great art, and the people along the parade route will agree with you. Who's going to stand up to Clem Greenberg and later to the Rockefellers who were banging for their bank lobbies and say this stuff is terrible?
Yes, I admit that I didn't see what I subsequently saw, and what I totally believe now, which is that to a very subtle but enormous extent, there was a huge orchestration going on.
But to others, the orchestration is irrelevant, and abstract expressionism can no more be smeared by its associations than Michelangelo for his Medici patrons.
It's important to say that the abstract expressionists weren't involved with the CIA. The CIA were involved with abstract expressionism. One of the reasons why abstract expressionists succeeded wasn't only because the CIA peddled it, is because it was aesthetically more powerful than what else was on offer. So it is true that the CIA were involved. I lament that as much as anybody else laments it. But that doesn't explain why it became important. Otherwise, why did the CIA fail on other occasions? There was something in the art itself that allowed it to triumph.
And what of the artists? Would they have resented the political use to which their work was put? It's worth remembering that nearly all the abstract expressionists had been Trotskyists, socialists, or communists in the 30s. The irony is that they'd survived the Depression by producing subsidized social realist art for the government's New Deal works projects. And yet the Cold War found these same artists now producing abstract art that became part of the fight against communism. And again, as in the 30s, they were subsidized by government coin. Mark Rothko became a committed anti-communist at this time. So did Robert Motherwell, and several others besides. But was this a license for the CIA to exploit their work? Ad Reinhardt, an abstract expressionist ignored by the official art world until the 1960s, had a unique take on this dilemma. Unlike the others, he remained resolutely left-wing, drawing illustrations for communist journals and advocating cooperation between America and the Soviet Union. And he delighted in pointing out the inconsistencies in the lives and art of his former revolutionary friends. In a series of lacerating cartoons, he mocked what he saw to be their inflated reputations and their cozy relationship with the establishment. And what of Jackson Pollock, the real driven genius of abstract expressionism, here seen at the very height of his powers? The film, shown countless times, has paradoxically come to symbolize the freewheeling, freedom-enhancing nature of the movement. He, too, like Greenberg and Motherwell, joined the American Committee for Cultural Freedom. But he did so mechanically, sodden with drink, and politically exhausted.
There's no doubt that we need to understand all art in relationship to its time, but that art cannot be reduced to those conditions. In other words, there well may be a terrain, a way of thinking about a Pollock painting that says, yes, there is something beautiful formally about this, that in a way it's a psychoanalytic picture. It's not a social picture, but it's an image of an inner landscape. And I don't think in that sense it can be reduced to a large political history. And I don't think it's any more reasonable to say that Pollock was supported by the CIA and therefore, that's why he became important. He became important because other painters could see what and in how he'd enriched the traditions of art. You stand in front of a Pollock and you see somebody thinking very, very hard about what painting might be now.
It's very easy to talk about culture, but talk about culture doesn't really have an impact on the public. For example, the CIA paid for the Boston Symphony to go over to Europe and make a tour. And I think that the Boston Symphony, the impact from that tour, people who said, heavens, the Americans, look what they do. the impact was much, much stronger than 4 presidential speeches by Dwight D. Eisenhower about culture and democracy. I don't think that could have happened except in America. And I'm glad the CIA was immoral. If that's immoral, to fund secretly something that is essential for the freedom of the world, if that's immoral, I'm glad.
We think that she has achieved a title to permanent remembrance as one of the most accomplished, ingenious, and interesting impostors in history.
Yellow Sound, a stage composition by Kandinsky. The blue mist recedes gradually before the light, which is a perfect, brilliant white. At the back of the stage, a bright green hill, completely round and as large as possible. The background, violet, fairly bright. The music is shrill and tempestuous, with oft-repeated A and B-A and B-A and A-flat. These individual notes are finally swallowed up by the raging storm. Suddenly, there is complete stillness.
I am freedom, I am life, I am a dream, I am weariness, I am unceasing burning desire, I am bliss, I am insane passion, I am nothing, I am play, I am freedom, I am life, I am a dream, I am weariness, I am feeling, I am the world, I am insane passion, I am wild flight, I am desire, I am light, I am creative ascent that tenderly caresses, that captivates, that sears, destroying, revivifying, I am raging torrents of unknown feeling, I am the frontier, I am the summit, I am nothing.